Hey y'all, welcome to the Sci-Fi Sci, a podcast about black science fiction and fantasy and staying on the same page in our marriage. Baby. I am your host, Amber Wallen, and I'm joined by my husband,
Benjamin Wallen, and you've paid us a single listen, so we'll tell you your fortune.
Today, we will be discussing the documentary Horror Noire, A History of Black Horror, directed by Xavier Neal-Burgin, and featuring actors like Keith David, Tony Todd, and Rachel True, director Jordan Peele, and author Tananarive Due. The film is inspired by Dr. Robin R. Means Coleman, who wrote a history book on black horror called Horror Noire. We will be discussing the documentary Horror Noire and also one of the films from the documentary that they talked about, Blacula, directed by a black director, William Craine, starring a black actor, William Marshall. Then, before we hop into this amazing Horror Noire documentary and these two amazing films, what you drinking tonight?
I'm drinking Spiteful Brewing, a Chicago-based brewery, so shout out to Spiteful Brewing.
Shout out. Thanks for asking me what I'm drinking as well. Great. I'm drinking a white wine. Love me a good Sauvignon Blanc. So we're going to loosen up. We're going to have fun. Cheers to horror. 'Tis the season.
Before we suck right in.
Ooh. No, maybe not. Before we sink our teeth into tonight's discussion, yes.
You're way better at improv.
I know. So Ben, before we hop into discussing everything tonight, why don't you share a horror story of your own?
I love hiking, as you know. Took you hiking in Thailand, surrounded by wild monkey snakes. You know I love hiking, so when you first took me down to Georgia, you decided to take me to the only mountain that you knew of, called Stone Mountain. Now, being a northern boy, simply driving down to Georgia was pretty shocking to begin with. On the way, I saw the largest Confederate flag. Nope. The largest flag ever. It was a Confederate flag, which I found interesting. You found horrifying. But you decided to take me to Stone Mountain. And we go to Stone Mountain, and we take a left down Robert E. Lee Drive, who was a slave owner who poured salt on his slaves' backs after they were whipped to, incite more pain. I was very confused about that there would be a street named Robert E. Lee Drive.
Oh yeah, well, welcome to the South.
So you...
God.
You thought I would want to hike up a mountain that the end journey was a monument dedicated to Confederate soldiers.
Here's the tea. I didn't even remember that was a thing. I'd only been to Stone Mountain a couple times in my life. And so I know that you love hiking. My little white husband loves to self a mountain. So I was like, oh, well, Stone Mountain. I remember hearing about Stone Mountain growing up. I had probably been once as a child, so let's take him there. And so I was just as horrified as you were when we got there, and I'm remembering, when you revisit something from your childhood, I'm remembering, oh, fuck. This whole thing is one big memorandum to these horrible Confederate soldiers.
That was the most racist hike I've ever taken in my life.
I would agree. That was bad. It's like, who is this money going towards? Now I feel bad for paying, whoever we paid to park.
Sons of the Confederacy. They're the people who actually buy plots of land throughout the South to post up massive Confederate flags.
And I gave them my $7 to park. That's the horrible part. And the gag is that there were tons of black people there. It's Stone Mountain. People go there all the time. Lots of people there taking pictures, having fun. And so it's comparable to like, here's Hitler Mountain. Let's go up it. It was horrible. It was a good hike though, right, babe?
The great horror writer Tananarive Due has said that what scares black people is very different than what scares others, or she might say what scares white people. In our case, makes a lot of sense. When we drive down to Georgia, I do see these Confederate flags, and it's sort of a symbol that I'm no longer in Kansas or Chicago. For you see that flag, and you're like, let me look away, cringe, like, it's a different type of emotion.
Yeah. Because there's nothing I can do about it. So it's like, oh, I'm just going to turn the other cheek. I'll see my mama soon. I'll get to Waffle House soon. It's fine. It's fine.
Horror Noire sort of looks at Black horror. Horror Noire breaks down Black horror in roughly 6 phases. So we're going to go through each phase step by step. Phase 1.
Phase 1
is Black people are the monsters. And they talk about the birth of a nation. And in Birth of a Nation, you see the villain who's dressed in blackface, who is this rapist. And there's this idea that representation does exist, because we have talked about there's a lack of representation, but no, beginning of horror films, Black people were represented.
They're just misrepresented.
They were misrepresented. And that, I think that's a very important difference.
Of course. When it comes down to it, I mean, it's sad that I have to make these choices, but honestly, I would rather be underrepresented than misrepresented. And I feel like, obviously, white people in blackface of Birth of a Nation, like, fetishizing white women and being, like, the ultimate evil because they're, like, hypersexualized, going after their white wives. Like, I would rather Black people be completely left out of that narrative any day of the week.
It makes me think of jobs you've turned down working with white folk who just want you there because you're Black.
Oh, for sure. I was listening to another podcast today that was talking about, like, there's a really big difference between tokenism and inclusivity. And I know sometimes those lines blur, but it's very clear when it's just like, y'all are trying to meet a quota, y'all need to not look racist, and y'all are actively making people feel included in the work. And they think we don't know the difference, but we do.
Yeah, this makes me think of another quote by Tananarive Due, where
oh, can I say it? Because that was the quote that gave me chills. Mm-hmm. Tananarive Due, who is a Black author, Black science fiction author who I've been loving. We've been reading a great horror novel by her. In the film Horror Noire, she says, Black history is Black horror. And it just, like, reverberated through my whole body, because it's so true. Like, our worst fears are not these, like, magical spells and ghouls and goblins. My worst fear as a child was waking up with, like, a burning cross in my yard, or getting the call that my brother has been killed by the cops. All of my worst fears are not, you know, is there a monster under my bed? It's just, it's meeting the white man monster outside of my home.
Yeah, and they
or in my bed, in this case.
White man monster in your bed.
Yeah.
That's the title of your first horror short story.
Of course it is.
I'm also, I mean, history, when you really, like, dive into history and you read about the presidency, you realize how horrific the presidency is. For example, The Birth of a Nation was screened in the White House.
Yeah, that's just horrific.
Yeah.
I mean, but that's not even shocking. I could see Birth of a Nation being filmed in the White House right now. Am I lying?
You're not lying.
Stand by and stand back. That's... Come on. They've watched that movie in there once.
I do wonder if we'll ever get to a point where Black writers can create Black monsters without this horrific subtext. And what I mean by that is I went to an improv group, all women of color, called Matt Damon Improv in Chicago.
Woo woo, shout out.
And there was a question that each of them answered, which was like, what type of role would you want to play if you weren't being typecasted? And many of the Black women were saying, oh, I want to be the villain. I want to be the monster. I want to get to a point where me being a monster isn't because of my ethnicity or the way I talk or the way I do my hair or the way I love myself. It's because I get to play a monster.
Yeah.
Which makes me...
With actual venom coming out of my mouth. It's not just because I have a fro.
Right, which reminds me of that great movie, Ma.
Oh my gosh! Yes, Benjamin! I still love Ma. Justice for Ma.
Ma?
What a great example. I just don't think that got the love it deserved.
It did not. It also wasn't directed by a black person.
Oh. Well, we don't have to think. We're talking about Octavia Spencer giving a great performance and being the villain for the first time ever. Like, that felt like some sort of justice.
It did. And it sort of reverts back to this first historical idea of black horror, which is black people are monsters. But Ma felt so differently than The Birth of a Nation and a lot of these other first films that came out.
Yeah, because she had actual motivation. She had been traumatized by her white classmates, and spoiler alert, she was seeking revenge on their kids and what have you, whereas in Birth of a Nation, the motivation is blackness. It's like, well, they're black. Of course they're lusting after our women. It's like, that's not a motive. What? Trash.
The first step is that black people were monsters. Phase two. Black people are the slapstick, the comic relief in the middle of a horrific event.
Yeah, this would have been the phase I was in.
They show unreasonable fear. They faint when they see the image of a ghost, and they become sort of the comic relief,
of course,
of the movie.
The shuck and jive. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And this is sort of led, this transition, this probably positive transition, is led by Oscar Micheaux. Oscar Micheaux is known for Amos and Andy, which is a very comedic type of show, where he says, don't engage in these like violent behaviors as the black monster. That idea, though, that the documentary looks into is still harmful, still damaging.
Of course. So phase one, we're monsters. Phase two, we're like slapstick idiots, Three Stooges noir.
Exactly. And again, that sort of pigeonholes groups of people. And so they're treated as props. They have no motivation. They just fall down. You still in that?
I'm anti the phase, but if there was a phase I would be in, it would definitely be this one.
I do know that in horrific situations, you try to sort of say something to alleviate the situation.
Oh, yeah. I gave a hell of a roast at my grandma's funeral.
That was sad. Was it horrific?
My grandma fucking died, Ben. Yeah, that's horrible.
What's the difference between sadness and horror?
Yeah, let's talk about that. Sadness, horror is haunting. Like, my grandma dying doesn't make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The thought of her dying does.
Going to her house and going through her things, you did try to be funny in that.
Yeah, because we were discovering real time that she was a hoarder.
We were.
You know, some fun horror story there. Do you know, my brother, thanks Thomas family for letting me tell all your business. My brother, when he was in high school, maybe he was a 9th grader, 10th grader, he broke his ankle, so he had to wear a cast for weeks. My dad was cleaning my grandma's house, and my brother's cast from years ago from high school that he had, had long since cut off of his leg, just, the white cast. It was in my grandma's closet in her house that my dad recently cleaned. So she threw nothing away. I guess she took my brother to get his cast taken off and just kept the cast. Why? That's horrific.
Anyway, you're the slapstick.
That's funny.
Oscar Micheaux, actor, director, known for Amos and Andy, says don't engage in these behaviors as the black monster. Stop taking on roles as the black monster.
So he's saying, instead be the comedian.
Instead,
be the grand old black guy. Your neighborhood-friendly black guy.
Exactly. So he flips the script, which is positive. It's a good thing.
Okay.
However, it still pigeonholes black characters. And they still play the maids. They still play the worker who faints when they see a ghost, who trips and falls amidst horror. So that's phase 2. Then we move into phase 3.
Phase 3!
The atomic age. And this is the time where scientists take center stage and all the horror comes from Godzilla and King Kong. So there's no place for slapstick. There's no place for servants. And black people disappear.
Yep.
However, they don't. really disappear. Blackness, the idea of blackness still becomes the horrific image. And even now you say, oh, you made a dark joke, right? Like we've talked about this before. And I'm always like, nope, use a different word when I'm working with my students. Nope, use a different word. Do you mean it was a sad joke?
Yeah. I don't care when people say dark humor. I'm just saying. I know that's like, if I was called a dark key, I would care. But when people are like, oh, I have a different humor, it's like a darker humor. That doesn't immediately say to me like black humor. That's a big deal. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I hear you, and dark is associated with bad or depressing humor. And when you use blackness and associate with depression, you sort of, again, like pigeonhole. Like,
I agree to disagree. Keep on with the faces.
Anyway, the atomic age happens. There are no black actors. However, there is King Kong. And King Kong is a metaphor for blackness.
Oh, for sure. For sure. It's so interesting, too, because I remember, I was talking about Mighty Joe Young when we were talking about Mad Max. And I was like, Mighty Joe Young didn't feel like a metaphor for blackness. Why? Because he was kind and loving and different things. But King Kong for sure felt like, oh fuck, this like black evil is coming for us.
Mighty Joe Young is a gorilla. King Kong is not a gorilla. King Kong is a metaphor who obsesses over white women and comes and grabs them and chews off their heads.
Yeah, but Mighty Joe Young was still, for some reason, taken from an African country, but for some reason he was living there with a white woman. You know what I'm saying? So they're slowly still trying to create that like lust or love dynamic between Mighty Joe Young and Charlize Theron. Because remember, she was in it.
I think we're getting off topic. Are we talking about Mighty Joe Young or The Blind Side?
You are trash.
Moving on. That was stage 3. We move into the atomic age, and the horror noir deals with this much better. We thought it was incredibly accurate that blackness is often used as a metaphor for evil and wickedness. You just read Harry Potter, or don't read Harry Potter. Phase 4 is black people as hood heroes.
I can get down with that.
But it also says that you can't be a hero unless you're like
rags to riches from the hood.
Yeah, and this is the Blaxploitation era, with the exception of the 1968 Night of the Living Dead, where Dwayne Jones becomes the hero. And Dwayne Jones is the actor, the main protagonist of Night of the Living Dead. Go watch it. It's important. It's a great movie. It's directed by a white man, and he adamantly says, I did not choose a black man to be a protagonist as sort of a racial, like, social justice statement. However, that doesn't make any fucking sense, because the day that they finished up shooting this, MLK had died. So this is like 1960s. We're in the 1960s, beginning of 1970s in the Blaxploitation era, and that never like rang true to me. When white people are like, no, I wasn't trying to do a specific like anti-racist type of movement. I just chose the best actor because I don't see color. That just has never felt comfortable with me. But George Romero has claimed, no, Dwayne Jones was the best actor. He needed to be the lead of this film, Night of the Living Dead, which is the slow-moving zombies that we see in The Walking Dead. I don't know, what are your thoughts about that? Like, can people just honestly choose a person because you're an actor, can a director just choose someone based solely on their standard acting skills?
Well, first off, you asked that question in in a way that you thought, like, you loaded the question.
There's only one right
First
answer
off, you
to
loaded
that.
the question. No, I definitely think that you can go in thinking you want one thing and then you get something else. Like, I remember one time as an actor, I decided to, like, and I'll preface this by saying I didn't get the part, but I decided to apply to be Brooke Wyndham. I auditioned to be Brooke Wyndham from Legally Blonde for a musical. And I remember thinking, like, oh, they'll never choose me, which they totally didn't, blah, blah, blah. But if you really think about the story of Legally Blonde, super quick, Brooke Wyndham is a woman who goes to jail, who's accused of killing her husband. Like, that could easily be a black woman. And people think she's a gold digger. Again, that could easily be a black woman. You're going to have to change the narrative a little bit, and maybe a little bit of the backstory, but why couldn't that be a black woman? I can fully believe that Dwayne Jones, a black actor, was the best actor that day. And he had undeniable talent. And Greg Ramiro, is that what his name is? George Ramiro? I'm sorry, you don't dropped a shit ton of names tonight. I'm trying to keep up with all the names, but...
I have failed as your husband, as your lover.
His name is Greg.
Oh, fuck.
George. It's a white name with a G. Jeff, right? So Jeff Ramiro, I'm sure...
Because you spell Jeff with a G.
Some people just spell Jeff with a G. It's like Geoff. I think...
You're right.
I know I am.
I think they pronounce it Joff.
No, it's not. It's Jeff. I think that you can have an idea of what you want in mind, you know, like I once had for my future family. And then one day, someone shows up to that casting call and you're like, you know, I didn't see it with you, but we can make it. You know, you really giving a hell of a performance right now. And you got the part.
Are you comparing me with Dwayne Jones, a black actor? Like, I showed up to your casting call.
Right.
For Night of the Living Dead.
Well, I'm not.
Which is what we're calling our marriage, Night of the Living Dead.
It is. It's a fucking horror story is what it is. But, yeah, I am comparing you to Dwayne motherfucking Jones. And he killed the part.
He did.
And then he was killed. So who knows? Stay tuned with you.
Go watch Night of the Living Dead. It's great. However, stage 4 that we were discussing is black people as heroes. And usually they're, for lack of a better term, like hood heroes. And this is the 1970s. We move away from the atomic age and the slapstick comedy. And so maids become pimps and hoes in the Blaxploitation films.
Maids become pimps and hoes. I'm sorry. You're doing great. Keep going.
And you get such classics like Blacula.
Can we stop and just ask for a Blaxploitation version of The Help? Because that would be a real fucking treat. Like a little Viola Davis, but with a little gold gun in her purse.
So you get such classics as Blacula, Dr. Black, and Mr. Hyde. I'm sorry, these titles are really...
I love them! You can please argue me up and down. I love when things are called black.
But you've told me this, that you're redefining a white story instead of just writing your own story.
Now,
you've told me that.
I do hate that. But I like when things... Well, because at this point, we're moving from, like what you said, phase 1... we're monsters. Phase 2, we're slapstick. Phase 3, we're not in it. Phase 4, we have to take the stories of white people because that's the 1970s, right? I don't like when that shit happens present day. But I can get down with Blacula. I can get down with Dr. Black and Mr. Hyde because I know what I'm getting into. And that appeals to, I'm sure if I was black in the 1970s, I would go see that movie because you've lived through a decade or a wave of time where black people were not even included. And so Blacula tells me two things. It tells me two things that are so powerful. One, that this is going to be a black movie. Two, that this is going to have a black lead. Which is powerful.
You saying that you putting yourself in the 1970s, you would go see these films, absolutely. It made me think of this assignment I once had where I had to write as I was in 1915. And it was so intriguing to like put myself at that time. However, I haven't done that in a while, and it would be really fun to write as if I was in the 1970s. But that just threw in my head. Another film that they looked at is Abby, and in this documentary they discuss the fear of black women in general and their sexuality. And this reminded me of a book that we have. One of the few books that we have in our house written by a white woman called...
Why is that so, Ben?
We've gotten rid of every single book written by a white person in our house.
You did that.
I did that.
Why'd you do that?
That's a long story.
Well, make it short.
I realized that I needed more authors in our house that were black and that represented you, because every time you leave the house, you enter into a space that despises and hates you. And I wanted to make this space as the most comfortable space for you.
So where are your white books? Did you stab them?
I burnt them all.
A big white fire!
With a wand.
Of course.
And some voodoo magic. No. So this made me think of the movie Abby, which they discuss. And they talk about the fear of black women in general and their sexuality. And we do have this book called Women's Anatomy and Sexuality. And I remember you discussing this book for the first time, and you getting like really pissed off because you're like, I didn't even know my vagina had that.
I know. Well, I'm going to tell you why I was pissed off about the book. So I didn't really even learn, and judge me all you want, but I didn't even really learn that women could masturbate until I was in college. Like, I knew I was doing something as a child, but I didn't have the language for it. And I damn sure didn't have like the sex toys and all of the magic, right?
Wand.
And so, wand.
Magic. Wand.
Shut the hell up. Anyway, it's all obvious. I bought this book that was called Women's Anatomy of Sexual Arousal, and it was supposed to be this sexual liberation and awakening for me. And maybe like the second or third page into the book was like, well, I know that most of you have already had amazing orgasms, but we're going to help you get to better ones. And at that time, I hadn't really had a true orgasm from a partner or anything like that. So I just immediately felt...
Written like a true white woman.
I know! I was like, this is not... 2 pages in, I already don't feel included into this. Like, you could have just opened with like, hey, everyone reading this book, you're about to experience and do some fun things, and we're going to go on this exciting ride together. You don't have to acknowledge that, like, no, I know you're too experienced for this. That's just so unnecessary. It's like, most people who buy this book probably have similar sexual experiences to me, right?
I wonder if someone watched Abby and then thought, oh, I can have a horde of zombie men and go masturbate.
All right, then we're going to move along. So the next phase, I proudly present Phase 5. You know how to do the echo?
Phase 5.
So in Phase 5, it's the 90s and the 2000s, and we meet the Sacrificial Negro and the Magical Negro, right? And it's funny because I had heard of the Magical Negro complex before the movie. It's like the Legend of Bagger Vance. It's like sometimes it's really, truly black people with these magical powers and characteristics and sidekicks and things like that. But the Horror Noire film taught me about the Sacrificial Negro, which is basically... it's Rachel True in The Craft. It's the black person who's there to just ask the white person, like, is everything okay? Are you all right? It's also the black person who is killed to save the white person, the white main character, which is so annoying. It's like, wait, my only purpose in this life is to protect some white person who never would think twice about protecting me. That sounds awesome. So the documentary film sort of outlined it as like, we don't know this monster's truly, truly bad until they kill this really kind, sweet, sacrificial black person. For example, they use The Shining. The guy who, his name fails me, but there's this it's the only black person in The Shining who is killed in the movie, but not in the book, because they had to sacrifice him for the film to show that this monster is really, really bad. Jack Nicholson's character, horrible. Why? Because he killed the wise old black man.
Which in the novel
Didn't happen. I said that.
didn't happen, right? However, there's levels to this shit, right? Nnedi Okorafor, great writer, and she wrote an essay that's on Strange Horizons called Stephen King's Super-Duper Magical
Negroes.
And in there, she talks about that
Sorry.
these people are given a much bigger role. And she looks at The Stand, she looks at The Shining, and however, it's still centering whiteness. And I will often come to you with an idea to watch a movie or to watch a show. I'm like, oh, this is great. It has, I think you would like this. And you watch it and you're like, yeah, but it's still centering whiteness because it's getting into that super duper idea that's still falling into tropes that horror noir looks at that go back since the beginning of cinematography.
And it's like these days, if people aren't getting out of those stereotypes and those different phases that have already been covered, like, I'm not trying to waste minutes of my life watching that.
There's too many good stories, like black stories now.
Negroes. I said it earlier, and it sounded sort of like a cheerleader. It's like, we are the Negroes. I'm going to keep that going.
Anyway, so the 90s, early 2000s, this is a phase where you introduce a monster, and this monster is shown to be truly horrible because they killed the Black Protector, which is a quote from the documentary. Great.
It would be funny if they fused phase 1, where we are monsters, and then phase 5, where we protect people from monsters. And what do you get? Black on black crime. Oh no.
Which actually Blacula gets into, but we'll get to that. So phase 6, Renaissance and Black Horror.
Phase 6, we have arrived.
And this is the point that Nnedi Okorafor says in her essay, where we've reached the point where the...
You want me to read something, Ben? Nnedi says, we've reached the point that magical Negroes have power that, if harnessed for personal intent, would change the story greatly. Ooh, I love that.
Yeah, Nnedi Okorafor.
Because I am magical, but it's for my intent.
Exactly.
Not Karen's.
We get Get Out, we get Us, we get...
Tales from the Hood, we get Ganja and Hess.
Well, Ganja and Hess was the 70s.
Well, you wrote it here. Sorry.
I did. Which was, we had arrived to this point earlier in the 1970s. Ganja and Hess was made.
Yeah, but nobody knows what that is.
No one knows what that is because...
Indie film.
It wasn't an indie film. So this film was made, but then cut.
I thought just like weird, fun movies that are slow developing, those are called indie films.
No. Indie film, no. No. So Ganja and Hess was... Ganja and Hess was a movie that did arrive at this point. And...
At phase 6.
At phase 6. However, the studio did not want to release it as originally cut.
Ahead of its time, like Nina Simone.
Ahead of its time. So they changed it to like Blood Couple or something. Go watch Ganja and Hess, more of that to come. So now we're in this renaissance in black horror. However, we want to backtrack a little bit. We want to look at that Blaxploitation film of 1972, Blacula.
Oh, so good. Go watch it. It holds up. I mean, it starts a little fast, but it holds up. I loved it. And I don't even like scary movies. My most scary movie I ever watched used to be Scary Movie. You know, the movie that was a parody of all scary movies. Ben, what was the first scary movie you watched?
Resident Evil. I still remember the scene in that film where a woman like throws up her hand in this shock scare, what they call it now. And that movie fucking terrified me. I had nightmares for months. Actually, I used to have waking terrors, and I would go around the house breaking things and flipping over tables and
What?
chairs.
What is a waking terror?
A waking terror is you are walking around in your nightmare physically.
It's like sleepwalking.
But a nightmare version. So I used to get so terrified, and I would throw over my nightstand and my dresser.
Wow. That's rough.
I've never told you that.
I know. I love having a podcast with you. I learned so much. You know what my first scary movie was?
Scary movie. I think that's what you
No, it wasn't. I used to watch movies like that. But the first scary movie I ever saw, do you know?
Eve's Bayou?
No. It was The Sixth Sense in theaters. It was horrifying because we went to the movie theater to see something else, and the only thing that was available was The Sixth Sense. Like, that was the only thing that tickets were available for. I didn't even finish the whole movie because I ran out of the movie theater screaming to the part where there were people hanging from the ceiling in the school. And it just reminded me of like all things slavery that we were learning at school. So I was scared the entire time. And then when I saw people hanging from the ceiling, I was like, nope, not on my watch. Because I already have to see so many images of people swinging from trees in history class. So I just ran out and I sat in the lobby until my friends and their parents came out. I was like, not me. And I had nightmares. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I could see the whole thing. True story. Isn't that a horrible first movie to see as a child? Like, when it came out. I saw it in theaters. Well, I saw half of it in theaters. Blacula.
This is a 1972 film directed by William Craine. Blacula. Initial thoughts, Amber?
Initial thoughts. Well, I love a black lead. Very short. Blacula is a story where this black man is bitten by Dracula and then wakes up years in the future because he's been locked in this coffin, and then he's terrorizing the city and biting people and whatever. But he lost his wife when he fell asleep many years ago, was killed many years ago. And then he sees a woman on the street that looks like his wife. It is, but they're playing it off as like it's a different actor years in the future. And the craziest part of this whole movie for me was that the vampire Blacula, aka Mama Walde, ran up to this woman and it's just like, you're my wife in a future life. You're my wife from centuries ago. And Tina, the lady, just goes with the shit. That was the most unrealistic part. Like, not the vampires, not the blood sucking, not the garlic and the steak. The most crazy part is that if a person came up to me and was like, no, but listen to me, you're my wife from centuries ago. And she's just like, I mean, okay. Don't do my sister like that. No black woman on God's green earth, on the universe's green earth, would just be like, oh, I'm your wife from years ago, of course. Like, he didn't have to present no receipts, nothing. That was crazy to me. What did you think about that?
I honestly, I was not concerned with that.
How? They just threw my girl Tina under the bus with that one because nobody would respond that way. Nobody would just be like, yeah, I guess I'm your wife from years ago and I guess you're a vampire, like, turn up. Without any proof? Why was she so trusting of him?
So we had watched this movie right after we watched Horror Noire because it's mentioned in Horror Noire. So I was looking at it through a lens of the 1970s Blaxploitation era. And so things of like realism weren't sort of jarring me, but...
Okay, well, what were your initial thoughts?
All right, my initial thoughts was like, whoa, there are gay characters in here.
Oh, like, yes, that was shocking.
Like, whoa, they reference sloppy cops. They literally say sloppy cops who butcher jobs that involve black victims. I was like, what? Wait, what? 1970s are already talking about shitty cops who don't give a fuck about black lives in a film. Mm-hmm. That surprised me. The other thing that surprised me was that there is a stripper, sort of stripper, who's also a photographer, which I thought was really cool. Because stripper photographers are just underrepresented. in film.
They're what?
Underrepresented.
Okay.
Stripper photographers are under... She's not a stripper, but she is a
go-go girl.
A go-go girl, and she's also a photographer who has her own dark room. I loved that. I did love that there were gay men in the film. And
there were.
An interracial couple. However, they are Blacula's first victim. So kill your gays, right? So it falls into that trope, which I had problems with. But But
there's a part of it where I don't have a problem with it because they then become part of Blacula's squad. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yes. So, however, in the film, and I think they do this intentionally, Billy and Bobby, they're not recognized as lovers. They're referred to as associates. However, all their dialogue, and there's actually quite a bit of it, is very sexual, and they talk about remodeling their house because they're the couple. They're this wealthy gay couple,
and they're interior designers.
Yeah,
yep.
From Los Angeles who go to Transylvania. They go to Transylvania and they, through circumstance, take Blacula's coffin back to L.A. and unlock it and unleash Blacula to the rest of L.A. But at one point, they talk about trading out their guest a bed for the coffin because they thought it would be funny. And I'm like, there's this a love between them that is felt in their dialogue. At one point, I think it's I forgot which one. I think it's Bobby who says, I'm going to light one of these greasy lamps to look around the storage in which they bottle the stuff from Transylvania. And I think Bobby responds, if the fire department could see you now, you silly lamp queen. So there's this flirtation that they have. There is this relationship that I did enjoy watching on screen from the 1970s. I didn't think gay people existed in the 1970s in film, but they for sure did. One of my favorite moments is Nancy gets, who is the go-go stripper girl / photographer. She gets a picture of Blacula at one point, and she, is going to go develop this picture, and there's a character who sort of comes on to her, and she denies him and says, I know what would develop with you in a dark room, and it wouldn't be my pictures. There are some of these slinger one-liners that I really appreciated throughout the film. I read a couple of articles about this, and a lot of the articles I read was that this sort of sets up African Americans against Africans. Mama Waldy is African, and he's brought to America, and an African American cop takes him down ultimately. And so there's this subtext that Africans are beasts, and the African American man is this great hero. The African American man is this great hero and takes down Blacula. That just made me think of sort of this dichotomy of African Americans and then Africans, or in this case,
Black Panther.
Exactly, sure. Or makes me think of the stories that you've told me about dating
Oh, yeah.
African.
Well, I do want to be clear. I have a lot of friends who are Nigerian and Liberian, and so I'm not going to hold this one asshole guy that I dated to be the voice of all African people, of course, but it was weird because I dated this guy who was Nigerian, and he just was always talking shit about lazy Black Americans. And it sucks because a part of that is what's portrayed in the media, what's portrayed in film. So he's just negatively talking about those things, what he's seen, and in the same way that white people talk about, well, I saw X amount of Black people were arrested, so that must mean they're all bad. But it's strange because we are Black Americans, we're of African descent, and so when other Africans are talking down on us in that way. It's kind of just like, you know that they think we're all the same here in America. Like, those people that say those things about us are going to think the exact same thing about you. That's why it's just like weird and ironic, of course.
And all of that, like, internalized hatred stems from white supremacy.
Of course.
N.K. Jemisin says that the rot of American society is white supremacy. Mm-hmm. And so you can actually trace any of this internalized fighting as a result of white supremacy. So the idea that there's that separation is a result of white supremacy.
Yeah, which I now know, but at the time I was like, this ain't gonna work if you just gonna keep talking shit. Like, we're in the same college, we make the same grades, you have very clear examples that narrative is not true, and you still believe it and refuse to believe anything else. Like, we can't be, boo.
And Blacula plays on that.
Of course.
It
I didn't honestly think about it like that, but for sure it does.
Blacula, it works well. There's a lot of flaws. They do use the F word a lot.
Blacula works. Yeah, it was the 70s and there were some gay slurs used, but I think ultimately, I think it was a win for Africans. I think it was a win for African Americans. It was nice to be represented as the villain, but like a boss. Even at the end of Blacula, he kills himself because he's lost the love of his life, and he takes control of that narrative. Nobody actually kills him to his death or anything. I really appreciated that.
I also love that he introduces himself as Momowaldi. Like, he doesn't take his slave name of Blacula. Dracula calls him Blacula at
Oh my God, good point.
And that just reminds me where I really wanted you to hyphenate your name, and I wanted to change my name and become Thomas Wallen.
You never shared that with me.
I did. You
did not. You were not adamant about it. Maybe you journaled about it.
Well, I was not adamant about it because when I brought it up, I started to realize that no, I'm choosing Wallen because Thomas probably...
Yeah, it's probably like a slave name or a name passed on, but you did not talk to me. You can act like you talked to me about that, but you did not talk to me about that. I
think I had some internal awakening, and so I was like, we don't have to bring this up because I know what she's getting at. You wanted your choice name. You wanted to choose your own name.
Because I get to do what I want. There's a lot in naming and deciding, like, what you want to go. Of course, like, your parents can give you a name, but there's a part of you that's like, my name can change. It doesn't... I get to be called what I want to be called, and that's something that humanizes me.
Well, you wear the Wallen name well.
Why, thank you. So why don't you, in your most ghoulish horror voice, more about the show?
In conclusion, Horror Noire is one of the greatest documentaries I've ever seen in my life. And Blacula is the greatest vampire I've ever watched. Take the screen. Momowaldi lives.
Boy, good night.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Sci-Fi Sci. Be sure to tune in next week for episode 4. We'll be reading The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor LaVille. Now let's talk about Mr. LaVille's resume. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including the World Fantasy Award, the British World Fantasy Award, the Bram Stoker Award, the Whiting Writers Award, the Guggenheim Fellowship, and many, many other awards as well. He was raised in Queens, New York, and now he lives in Washington Heights. So don't miss next week where we'll be discussing The Ballad of Black Tom. Bye, y'all.